on today's show.
A couple months later, I was at a startup weekend, and I said, "Hey, there's probably someone down the street that would love to take a dog like ours that would do it for less money. It'd be a better experience for us and the dog, and we'll call it a place for Rover."
Yeah.
And we pitched that. Got a minute to pitch it. Got a team of 10 folks, and it's 6-7 years later, or 5 years later, it's like a $300 million plus, business. So really exciting to be able to have an idea and pitch it, and then have it actually turn into a real company.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Creator Institute podcast. Your host, Greg Koester.
Hey everyone, on today's episode, we're going to meet a longtime friend of mine, Greg Gottesman. And if you want to get something, there's a little bit of something for everyone in this episode with Greg. Greg has had really this incredibly unique and unusual career path that started actually with a book. And it started with a series of books when he was in college that went on to become one of the leading books about sort of college survival guide that he's done dozens of editions now and become something pretty incredible. So we'll talk a little bit about his experience writing a book while in college and the power that had and even the joys and the challenges of co-authoring a book with his wife. And we'll talk about his experiences kind of going through different graduate school experiences and how it colored his future career. Greg went on to be a venture capitalist, but he was really colored by his experiences in law school and ultimately at Goldman Sachs. And today we'll talk more about what he's doing, which he is now running one of the leading startup studios, Pioneer Square Labs, which is this opportunity to really create companies every day. They are a laboratory that is taking startup ideas and very quickly testing and iterating from it. But Greg is someone who I think can teach a lot of us about the power of never being satisfied, never kind of stopping that creative energy. And I think what I enjoyed most about talking to Greg that I think you'll really like is this insatiable curiosity and the fact that many of the steps and the changes in Greg's what might look like a very traditional path were sort of surprised people in it. So enjoy the episode with Greg. He is someone who's dynamic and insightful, and I think can share a lot about this sort of this very unique and differentiated path through venture capital and ultimately into becoming an entrepreneur, and today running the startup studio. Greg Gottesman, everyone. Greg Gottesman, super excited to chat today. And I think what I'm excited about with this is I think you and I have known each other for almost probably closing in on a decade here now or so. And
at least,
at least. And so for was preparing to chat with you, I actually got to do a little bit of cyber stalking and learn some things about you that I didn't know. So that was exciting for me. And so I want to chat about the author, Greg Gottesman, and how this crazy, you must have been early, right? Like who decides to write a book about college at that point? And how did that all come together? Because I think the best-selling college survival guide, maybe in history, but how did that whole thing happen? Because I'm curious about your path towards authorship at the start of your young career.
Yeah, I wish there was I probably could invent a better story, but when I went to college, I went to Stanford and my mother, after I went to college, put on a conference to, I think it was a day or two seminar for kids that were applying to school in our community. And she had speakers, and then they would sell books. So most of the books they would sell would be these books that have always been around, which were books like, what are the 50 best colleges to go to, or what are the top 200 colleges, and details about what those colleges were about and what life at those colleges was like, and then and then there was books about how to get into those specific colleges, and applications, and SAT books, of course. And so she said, "Hey, why don't you go to the Stanford bookstore and see if you could find any other things that I'm missing?" And so I went there, and what I was looking for was something like, well, how do you survive? I was in my freshman year at that point of Stanford, And so I was just going through the first year and I was looking for different kinds of books, and I couldn't find any relevant books written sort of to students about how to have a successful first year. Like once you actually
and there was no internet either too. So you couldn't like just find that information anywhere else either.
No, the way you would do it, there wasn't internet the way we think of. There maybe was the earliest versions of the internet. This was 1988. So maybe somewhere in some lab somewhere, there were people connecting computers to one another, but no, there was no internet the way we think of it today.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, the way you would research this is you just go into a bookstore and you start looking around. And I couldn't find any books about how to survive college. Certainly not anyone written by a student or someone who I would actually think would be interesting. And so I said, gosh, I should write one. And I've kind of always been, as you sort of look, here further out, a kind of person that if I see something that's missing, I think, well, why shouldn't I just go do that? So I basically gathered together a bunch of friends and started talking to them about this idea. And during my freshman year, and then between my freshman and sophomore summer, started writing a book about how to survive your first year of college. Written for students by students. So I had anecdotes from 100 different students, and it was one of the first books. I don't know if there were any other that basically had all these little anecdotes from students about their experiences at college. And anyway, long story short, I didn't really know what I was doing. I sent a couple chapters to, I think, 2 publishers, maybe 3. And one of them wrote back and said, and this was Simon & Schuster at the time, or a division of that, and said, yeah, we're interested. And they sent me a contract. I would have paid them to publish the book because I was so excited.
Right.
They sent me a contract. I didn't, in retrospect, when it became very successful, I realized I probably should have done more negotiating. But I was just so excited someone might actually publish my book that I signed the contract and went through a bunch of editions and was very, very successful.
Yeah, and did you sort of, did you sort of even realize that you were kind of creating this little mini sort of empire in some ways? Like, because it's then became, right? Like, you went on to publish law school version of this. Like, did you sort of have any aspirations that this would become a multi-series, even multi sort of educational experience sort of set?
No, I had no aspirations of becoming anything other than college survival, and I didn't have any aspirations other than having it go into its first edition. And then the first printing sold out really quickly, and then it went through, I think, 7 or 8 printings of the first one, and then it had 7 editions, and so I had no aspirations when I first wrote it that it would become anything more than, wouldn't it be just awesome to have a book published?
Yeah, it would be awesome.
I really loved writing, so I was on the newspaper. I was the editor of my high school newspaper. I was on the newspaper at Stanford, and so I was really interested in writing, and so it was just a lot of fun. And a real passion area anyway for me to write and to kind of have, if you listen, college survival is no Hemingway.
I thought there was a whole chapter on partying though. So like, come on, you had to have, you just tapped into the zeitgeist.
Yeah. You'll really get to understand my sad life. If you read the original book there was a chapter on doing your laundry because I totally messed that up, and little tips like which I don't think exist anymore, but like bring have a glass of quarters by your bed. I mean, little important tips, like that today would be completely meaningless. But yeah, so it was just really fun. I got help from a bunch of friends from around the country and a bunch of folks that were going to school with me at Stanford, and we published it, and it ended up being really successful. And then because of that, when it enabled me to then do the law school survival in high school one too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And did any, you were in some ways, was that your first entrepreneurial endeavor? Like, that was a business, right? Effectively.
Yeah, that was my first entrepreneurial. That was the first real entrepreneurial endeavor. I mean, obviously I had lemonade stands and much smaller versions of, but yeah, in terms of having a real, it basically paid for graduate school, which was fantastic. Or certainly the certainly helped to do that.
Yeah. Did that sort of experience, either directly or indirectly, help you in your kind of adventures thereafter? You go to graduate school, you have, sort of your experiences working in consulting and graduate school, like any of those things. Did the book, your author empire, lead you to any of those sorts of interesting places?
I think it certainly helped in terms of having something fun to talk about with prospective employers. I think one of the things that is crucial when you're going into interviews is having interesting stories that sort of make you differentiated from all the other students that are also, talented and smart and have good grades and good scores and all that thing and all those different things. And for me, having the book really gave me something that was quite a bit different than I think most other folks. It's easier now to publish a book, and more people do it, and more people should do it, because it's it has gotten where you can just using technology, not just publish something but distribute it. Back then, it was much more difficult. There were all these gatekeepers you had to go through. So for me, it was a real differentiator and something I was really proud of. It also, there's something about having something tangible.
Yes.
That I still, even today, I've started a bunch of businesses, as you know, and invested in even more. Having a tangible product that you can touch and feel and look at, there's something psychically different about that and rewarding about that. And so that was really, and continues this day to be really cool.
Yeah. Now, because you have kids in college, right?
My oldest is applying to college as we speak.
So is this going to be the Gottesman, handoff here? Do we have like the new era of the College Survival Guide that you're going to co-author? It feels like a thing.
I'm old, and no, I don't think so. I think it's interesting, and this with children, and I think people want to have different paths, and so my sense is that my two sons and daughters and my daughter will take different paths than I did. And so I've never even talked to them about publishing an updated version. It's not a terrible idea.
Yeah.
Probably the most likely person to do it may be my daughter, who's on the newspaper and loves to do this kind of stuff. But I'll mention that to her. I'll say that Eric. You'll help her.
I'm in on this one. I mean, I do think it's an interesting thing. I wonder how much of your survival guides, how much would be applicable. If you pulled out the last version of it, that's from the early 90s and sort of looked at it, 25 years later, I wonder how much would still apply.
I think certain things will apply, like how to get along with a roommate, chapters about time management, but there was no such thing as social networking, for example, when we went to school. And so those sorts of things, I think, are so different. And I just think the way in which technology has pervaded, college and what you do, I think is different. But still, a lot of the more social and person to person aspects, I think, are just the same. We're human beings, like trying to get along with other human beings, and so that stuff stays the same for sure. Yeah,
you'd have to have a different chapter on Instagram. That would be for sure. Your Snapchat would be definitely much richer. So I guess tell me a little bit about the path from sort of college Greg, and because at the time, even you developed this business. Again, paying for graduate school is no small feat when you're thinking about launching an authorship. Did you think about at that time kind of going into that direction, or was sort of the path in consulting and eventually into graduate school sort of always what you thought you would sort of do?
Well, I always thought I wanted to be a lawyer.
Really?
Yeah. That was my goal from the time that I can remember thinking about careers. In fact, I think if people would have asked me even in elementary school what I wanted to be, I think I would have said I want to be a lawyer. And the reason that I was so focused on that was that a lot of the people I looked up to in my family were lawyers. My dad was a doctor. a surgeon, and I wanted to have a different path than he had. And his brothers were lawyers. I thought that I really looked up to them. It sounded like what they did was exciting. Most of them were in the courtroom and were litigators. And it just seemed like an interesting life. It involved...
You're a writer, right? So that was probably the better fit as you enjoyed writing. There's a lot of...
I enjoyed writing, and I enjoyed debating, and I enjoyed, all the things associated with the kind of superficial version of what the law
the stuff that lawyers don't hardly ever do.
That's right. The things that lawyers don't do, I really found appealing. And I just thought that was going to be my path. And so even if you look at like some of the first classes I took in college were about the Constitution, and I tried to take classes from different lawyer, if there was lawyers teaching, adjunct faculty, I would take classes from them. And my major was, I took a bunch of economics, but my major was political science. And I did that because I expected to go to law school and be a lawyer.
Yep.
That was always what I thought I was going to be. And I didn't really have, I think I naturally am entrepreneurial, but I almost in some ways, I think this idea of being a lawyer kind of pushed that aspect of my personality a little bit to the side. And so because I was really determined that I wanted to go to law school.
Yep. Were you a lot of lawyers that I've spoken to did debate, and they liked the debating aspect. Did you debate in high school or college at all? Was that something you were involved in?
I didn't do classic debate just because I was more involved for some reason I chose newspaper and was really involved in student government. And so I think had I not been so involved in student government and newspaper, I would have done debate. But I did like to debate.
Yep.
I'm a natural. If you ask my wife, I try to debate. She's also a lawyer.
Yes. Guilty.
But yeah, I think I love debating, but I didn't do. I never sort of found the kind of the way in which debate clubs did their competitions. I didn't find that quite as exciting as newspaper for some reason, or student government. And so I focused more on those other things. But that probably, if I had a little extra time, I would have done debate. Yeah.
That's great. And so then when you took a job in consulting, was that sort of, was there a reason that you went in that route? Was it sort of designed because you thought that would most likely increase your chances of getting into law school, or how did you pick what your sort of first job was?
This is going to make me sound absolutely terrible. So
I can vouch for you're not absolutely terrible. Let's hear it.
I really wanted to be a Rhodes Scholar because I thought that would help me get into a good law school, probably.
Yep.
And so I went and tried to do that and didn't get one. Didn't I made it through a couple rounds or whatever, and then no, I was not a Rhodes Scholar, and so by that point I hadn't actually taken the LSAT or prepared for it. I kind of was a little behind there, and I'm like, okay, let me go. I still always intended to go to law school, but I said, let me go, interview with all these firms that were coming onto campus and see what that's about. And so I did interview with consulting firms and investment banks and, firms like, again, people that were coming to campus just to try it out. Why not? And kind of really thought that consulting sounded like an interesting thing to learn business. What was the downside of getting paid more money than I deserve to be paid at the time? And then as part of that, I had always planned then during that job that I would also study for and prepare for the LSAT, which is I did. Yeah.
And then did you intend always? I mean, you went double grad school here with the MBA, the JD MBA route. Did you think that did that experience lead you into that route, or was it with did you always think that you were going to do that?
Everyone at BCG and firms like McKinsey and the investment banks, everyone applies to business school. Very few people apply to law school from there.
Yeah, you were an ugly duckling on that front.
Yeah. And so at that point, Harvard Business School did not require the GMAT. And I hadn't taken the GMAT, but everyone else was applying. And so I thought, why the heck not?
Yeah.
And so I applied to Harvard Business School. And then I also applied to a bunch of law schools. So I was always intending to go to law school, but I thought, why not also just apply to this business school? It seemed like a lot of people were doing that. And of course, who knew, not expecting that I would get in, but I did. And I also got into Harvard Law School. So, and then you apply to a third school, which is the JD MBA thing, but that's sort of a little perfunctory. And so that's how it ended up happening. I really had fully intended just to go to law school. And I happened to get into business school, and that really changed my trajectory, I think, in some ways, because it's sort of, I really had a great time at business school in addition to law school. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me about that. I mean, obviously you're going into law school, or even thinking about applying to law school, with a lot of the Perry Mason dreams, right? Like probably be a courtroom lawyer. I'm good at arguing. Did that sort of experience as being able to do the business school side of things at the same time change the way you thought about lawyers, change the way you thought about law? Like what was the shift in your mindset that happened when you sort of got that complementary piece of your experience?
Well, yeah, certainly being, having then worked in business for a couple of years. By the way, before I did BCG, I also went and was the finance director for an attorney general race. So again, back to the law.
Yep.
I really thought I wanted to be a lawyer, and so the campaign that I was excited about working on was for attorney general of the state of Washington.
Yeah, you were going deep. You were going deep on law, right? Like this is like the Greg Gottesman at that point was like, this is he would probably not recognize the Greg Gottesman of today, would he?
No, I don't think I would have seen myself as an entrepreneur for sure.
Yeah.
Even though I had written these books and obviously very entrepreneurial in that way, I really thought I was going to be a lawyer.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to do.
Yep.
And the thing is that everything that sometimes I feel like law is something, if you're really good at school, which,
yes.
I was really good at school. Like I'm like an exceptionally good at school. I don't know what else that prepares you for, but I'm good at school.
Yeah.
And, and then, I'm a pretty good test taker, and kind of a natural, easy path is to go down the law route.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't like, I feel like a lot of times people sort of go down this path because they're pretty good at, like, if you're a lawyer, a lot of times you're pretty good at school. You go, you can get into, you're pretty good at test taking. You get into a decent law school. You're pretty good at law school, and then you go and you're a pretty good lawyer. And 20 years later, you're like, what the hell am I doing?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that easily could have happened to me. I was fortunate that I had a couple other things get in my way that didn't allow me to ease what was the path of least resistance, which I perfectly would have taken.
Yeah. Did you go through the traditional, I guess, let's talk about that. Like, obviously the traditional path in law school is you sort of, at some point you do the on-campus interviewing for big firm jobs, right? Like that's kind of what most people sort of associate with the traditional law path. How did that play out for you? Because like, what did that experience look like for you that sort of, as a JD MBA, that may have gotten in your way a little bit, so to speak?
Well, I was a JD MBA and I did well in law school. So a lot of the firms were interested in me specifically on the business side. So They actually, in many ways, were pushing me towards, because they thought that's what I would be interested in too, because I was an MBA. And I was interested in exploring both the transactional side in addition to litigation. So I was interested, and I talked to firms about both. Just interestingly, so when you do a JD MBA, you have 3 summers.
Right.
So I went for my first 2 summers. Again, I still thought I was going to be a lawyer. I fully intended that. I worked at law firms. So I worked my first summer at a firm here in Seattle called Foster Pepper. And I had a wonderful summer. I loved it. It was really interesting. I worked on some interesting cases. I worked both, on the litigation side and also on the doing some securities and business transactional stuff. I really enjoyed it, and I got to sit in on some depositions and write questions for depositions. It was fantastic, and I just thought it was a lot of fun. And then the second summer, I again interviewed for law firms. I worked at a great firm in New York called Davis Polk for most of the summer, and then also worked at Perkins Coie, another firm here in Seattle, for a small part of the summer. And I thought that was pretty fun too. One of the things at Davis Polk that I did was a bunch of securities work for. I actually worked, I think, on a transaction with I'm trying to remember, with a couple investment banks, and that was really interesting. But again, a lot of due diligence and documents, and I did find it interesting. But what was most interesting was then in my third summer, I decided I would try a business job, and I worked for Goldman Sachs.
You were like the blue blood of all blue bloods here. You're like, Goldman Sachs and Davis Polk, and I mean,
well, the nice thing was so I had the JD MBA, which was a positive. I was on the Harvard Law Review.
Yep.
So I was a good candidate. Little did they know I didn't know what I was doing, but I looked really good on paper for sure.
Yeah.
So I got a lot of job offers because I seemed like I knew what I was doing, because I was good at school and little else. But at that point, so I
world-renowned author. Let's not forget that world-renowned author.
I was a world-renowned author, and I published again at that point. I had published Law School Survival.
Oh yeah, okay, got it. Yeah.
But but by the end of that last summer, I worked at Goldman. One of the things I realized was when I was at the law firm, I was working for an associate who was working for a senior associate who was working for a partner. Mm-hmm. When I was at Goldman, I was, even as a summer associate, the partner who I never got to meet, or not I didn't get to meet, but I didn't get to talk that much with at Davis Polk, was the guy on the phone with me as a summer associate.
Interesting.
So I was like, wait a second.
Yeah.
This is a little bit off. And one of the reasons why I ended up, it was kind of that summer at Goldman was a little bit of a mind shift for me, because I realized, at least in the food chain of securities and transactional work, the investment bankers were higher on the food chain. And they didn't seem to be working as hard as the lawyers. I didn't even think they were as smart, but they seemed to be directing what the lawyers were doing. And I was like, wait a second, if I'm going to do this, why wouldn't I maybe just go work as an investment banker?
Were you looking at this economically at all? Or did you sort of, was it at that point, Greg, make more money? You
make so much more money.
Yeah.
As an investment banker. And I'm not someone who cared that much about that.
Right.
But it was hard not to recognize just where the value chain, the differences in the value chain, if you were going to go in that kind of work. Now, if you were going to do litigation, I still think the lawyers sort of had were in control a little bit more.
Right.
And I was still very interested in that. But definitely that summer at Goldman Sachs was eye-opening for me in terms of as a summer associate, how much control I had over a transaction versus what I felt like I had as a lawyer working at Davis, even a great firm like Davis Polk.
Yeah. Did you ever have any of the, I think one of the famous sort of stereotypes of investment banking is like the 72 hours straight awake working on a deal. Did you have any of those sorts of experiences that summer that kind of led you to learn about the dark side of investment banking at all?
Yes, I did, but I loved it. I'm a glutton for that. I was young and I didn't need to sleep much, and at the law firms too, there was a little bit of that. But I was gung ho about spending all night doing transaction. I was just eating it all up because it was different. I didn't think I would spend my whole life doing this, but like for a couple of years, why not?
Yeah. Did you have any specific transactions you remember that were like kind of the ones that you feel like, led you to understand sort of, because now in some ways, you've sort of seen the full cycle now that you've been in all of the aspects. Any of sort of like IPOs or transactions or things like that you sort of remember from that experience?
It was like 25 years ago now. So,
yeah.
There was like a Heartstream IPO I think I worked on, and I worked on this interesting M&A transaction, and that was a really busy summer. I think that was the summer of 96, 97. So that was a really busy summer, and it was super fun.
That's awesome.
Again, I that was sort of the summer where I started making this shift. But before my fourth year, I still was probably 60-40. I was going to go do law. And after that summer, I was like, 70-30, I was going to do business. That was the summer. Had I not, because I had spent those 2 summers, in law, working for law firms and enjoying it. And then I had spent that summer, and I was like, wait a second, and it was a subtle thing, but I just came back to my JD MBA thinking a little differently about what I would do with my initial job out of law school.
Did you find either of those two experiences? I mean, obviously you're sort of a rare person who had like high level investment banking side of finance world. You had the consulting world, and you had sort of big law. Did you find any of those experiences to be more akin to what you've seen as an entrepreneur? Like did any of them feel like they scratched that they're more entrepreneurial than the others, just in your sort of limited experiences early in your careers?
I think the speed of investment banking is the most similar. Because at least at that time, there were so many different transactions going on. You're typically working on multiple transactions. And, a lot of it was 80-20 rule where you would, you weren't looking for perfection. You were just trying to get things done. And so, just the speed of it, I think, was most like, being an entrepreneur. Whereas consulting was, I think, the least like it, because
interesting.
It was very much, slow moving. You work with big companies, you take 3 months on a project, and it tended to be the strategic elements of it were interesting, but so much of being an entrepreneur these days is about test, and letting, that felt just the speed of that feels more like investment banking, but nothing. Again, entrepreneurship is its own animal. And by far, by the way, of all the things that compared to all those things, about 1,000 times better than any of those other.
Yeah, it is crazy, right? But I think you can't know that by hearing about it. You sort of, there's like, you have to experience it, right? And I think it's certainly interesting. So tell us then, so take us then through, you made in a lot of ways like an interesting leap from there. How did the move into venture happen from, you've come back from I've had 3 summers of experience, traditional law, and then onto the investment banking side. How did you make the move into venture?
This is going to sound, again, strange, but so I wanted to go back and work for Goldman Sachs. They had given me a great offer. I could have done, technology banking, which is what I was really interested in, and I could have done some private equity. And my wife and I are both from Seattle. We were married, are still married. And she's the co-author of the law book too, right? So that must have been. Were you married when you co-wrote that book? Yes, and we stayed married throughout the.
Yeah, I was going to say
that's not
like a sign.
I recommend, by the way, writing a book for a spouse is, but she's fantastic, and so she said, hey, because we were starting to think about, okay, what's a family going to look like, and I think she really wanted to be around our parents, and when we were to have a family and so forth. And so she said, you at least have to try to look in Seattle before we make this move to New York. So she is a lawyer, and she had spent the summer working at a big law firm when I was at Goldman Sachs, and we never saw each other, like never. And I kind of still thought it was exciting. She's like, this is this isn't a great life. I mean,
Yeah.
it might be fun, but it's like, so she's like, you at least have to try to go find something in Seattle. So, or at least look. And so I went and talked to a bunch of places, got some interesting offers. And I talked to this group of guys at a firm that just sort of kicked off called Madrona Investment Group.
Mm-hmm.
And they, at that point, weren't doing venture as much as private equity. They were doing, more big deals. They had a relationship with the Bass Group, out of Texas. But I met these guys and I just fell in love with these guys. One was Bill Ruckelshaus, who was a former, he was one of the guys that Nixon ordered to fire the special prosecutor, and he
really
stepped down.
Some amazing dinner conversations.
Yeah, and so that was the Saturday Night Massacre, and he was the former acting director of the FBI and had been a Fortune 500 CEO. And Jerry Grinstein had been the CEO of Burlington Northern, the CEO of the precursor to Delta, and then he became the CEO of Delta while I was at Madrona, actually. And Tom Alberg, who was this fantastic lawyer who used to run the largest law firm here, but then had started doing some more entrepreneurial type things for McCaw, and Paul Goodrich, who was also, was a little bit younger than those guys, but was just a really super smart former litigator that was doing really interesting things in business. And they kind of had pooled their money and they were making some investments and doing some private equity stuff, but it wasn't clear exactly what the direction they were going to head is. But I just fell in love with these guys, and I thought, gosh, I can always go back to Goldman Sachs. I always had this philosophy that you make decisions not based on what, but who. And in retrospect, it was a little bit crazy, but that's kind of entrepreneurial in that way.
Yeah.
I said, hey, I think these guys are really interesting. I can learn a lot from them. And they offered me, and they just had a Greg Gottesman appreciation dinner. So Paul Goodrich pulled out my original contract, which was, I think I was making a fourth of what I would have made at Goldman Sachs. But it was sort of the chance to work with these incredible guys and maybe build something. And
see, this redeems all the fact that you were like, hey, you were saying, this money thing, it redeems you there. You're like, taking it for the people there and the fourth of it. And, who knew that it would sort of pay off in spades?
I've always thought that because I work really hard, and I never was worried that I was going to starve. And, again, my wife was a lawyer. She was going to work for a law firm. She made more money than I did that first year, first and second year at Madrona. So I thought, I was like, we were going to be fine. And I wanted to make a bet on these people. And Goldman, of course, was surprised, but I thought, I could go back there if I needed to. And we just started this adventure. So that was really the first kind of crazy entrepreneurial thing I did was join this firm that at that point had some guys who are essentially, more or less retired and we're kind of doing some interesting things. Not Paul and Tom as much, but Jerry and Bill, and started working with them. And they are four of the most incredible people on the planet. And one of the neat things about them was, as I looked up to those guys, I thought, gosh, if I could live a life half as interesting, a quarter as interesting as they had, that would be a pretty darn good life. So I thought would be a good place to start. So that's, While I was there, the way it worked is they were paying me basically out of their pockets. So wasn't, I think, that much fun for them. And in order to make investments in startup, so Tom, right before I joined, had made an investment in this little company called Amazon. And that turned out to be a good investment.
Sort of.
Yeah, this was early days though. Tom was among the very first investors, and he was like the first board member. I don't know if he was officially the first, but I don't know, maybe Jeff Bezos was, or something like that. But anyway, he was among the first. And we started, because of that investment, getting a bunch of business plans coming across our way. And Tom had also done some other investing in some startups. And I started looking at all these early stage startup companies and really enjoying, meeting with them, talking about their plans. And they had structured this crazy thing where they would loan me money to make investments alongside them in these companies, which at the time I didn't realize how crazy, irresponsible it was that I did do that. And one of the reasons why Madrona exists today is I got a little bit nervous that I was taking on too many loans. And I went to Tom and Jerry and Bill and Paul, and I said, we should raise a fund. We're having a lot of success. We had a lot of success in some of those early investments, and we should raise a fund to go and do this, more, in a more formal, serious way. And
were you acting as lawyer?
Madrona Venture Group started. Say it again.
Really? So were you acting as like, in what capacity were you mostly acting? Were you acting as more of the business guy? Did you dust off any of your legal skills? Like, how did your skill set apply your skill set even as we'll call it sort of the jack of all trades, Greg Gottesman, even before it was sort of a formal venture firm? Yeah,
I was using all my skills. So I was doing term sheets and transactional documents, and obviously we had law firms. Tom was the head of the securities practice at Perkins, and Paul was a lawyer. But for some of these early deals, we were moving really quickly on these seed deals. I would read the documents and I would play a little bit of lawyer, probably more business. Like, should we make an investment or not? I would write up memos and bring people in for final, and due diligence on the various business plans. And so at age 29, so I was an associate in both certainly in a business venture capital capacity or seed, I would say seed venture capital capacity, and also doing a little bit of the law stuff, but at age 29, then I became managing director of our first fund.
That's amazing. That's amazing. It is awfully funny how in some ways that probably the decision to go to business school probably was the reason that all those things happened. And had you might have been just a traditional lawyer had it not been for that sort of extra summer.
I think that's very true. I'd like to believe that, because I had this weird thing where I just think about when I look at different things, I think, oh gosh, I can, like, whether it was this book or now if you look at Rover.com, a company that I started, or Mighty AI, or the 9 companies we spun out here. I do have a knack for just thinking like that I could be part of solving a problem.
Right.
Maybe as a lawyer, I would have found my way here, but I doubt it, because I'm sure I would have been good enough as a lawyer, probably quite good, hopefully. And I probably would just be, practicing law. Yeah. And I don't think quite as happy. Yeah, no,
I think that's, so you brought up a story. I tell this story sometimes, but I'd love to hear you tell it, of the Rover story, because I always, it's one of my favorite stories about you, just because it's such a fascinating sort of story. Would you tell the sort of the Rover story and Startup Weekend, in some ways, how that whole experience came together? Because it's kind of remarkable.
Yeah, well, Eric, you and I both really got into the Startup Weekend stuff because it was so invigorating.
Yep.
It was a way to spend a weekend and just really exercise your kind of creative, juices on trying to see if you could start a company.
Yep.
So I judged at a bunch of these competitions, but I also like to go and attend them.
Yeah.
As did you.
Yep.
And I know you judge them too.
You and I are like those people who are like addicts. Like my wife is like, you can't go anymore because you're too addicted to them. So I think you and I have that same disease.
Would tell me, like, you have young children at home. What are you doing?
Right.
I would try to bring them with me because I thought it was so much fun.
Yep.
To go to these. Now, basically, what I do all day is essentially an extended startup weekend. That's my day job.
Yep.
So I basically, instead of just doing it on the weekends, I now literally do it every day.
Awesome.
That's how much fun it is. That's basically what being running a startup studio is about. And we also have a venture fund, but I like the Startup Weekend stuff. That's what I kind of found, just like you found your calling. I feel like this is what I was meant to do. So thank you to you and other folks who helped to push Startup Weekend forward. I kind of found what I really enjoy.
Yep.
Which is starting these companies from scratch. So anyway, we had a bad family experience with our dog at a local kennel. Actually, just down the street from where our office is here, where we had dropped her off, and it was expensive. I think it was $45 a night.
Wow.
And then we ended up, we were playing Hoop Fest. So we were coming back, which is in Spokane, the world's largest 3-on-3 tournament. The kids were playing in it. And coming back, we were a little bit late to pick up our dog, and they wouldn't let us get Ruby, and so we ended up paying more. When we finally picked her up, she had kennel cough and was all scratched up. It was just one of the world's worst customer experiences. So a couple months later, I was at a Startup Weekend, and I said, hey, there's probably someone down the street that would love to take a dog like ours that would do it for less money. It'd be a better experience for us and the dog, and we'll call it a place for Rover.
Yeah.
And we pitched that, got a minute to pitch it, got a team of 10 folks, and it's 6-7 years later, or 5 years later, it's like a $300 million plus, business. So really exciting to be able to have an idea and pitch it, and then have it actually turn into a real company. Years later, one of the fun stories is that one of the folks that I worked with on that Startup Weekend was a kid named Phil Kimmey, who was home for summer and didn't have a legitimate summer job. He was a developer. He was kind of working on some side projects, and he was the best developer on the team by far that weekend. And so I said to him, hey, Phil, after we won the Startup Weekend, I said, what are you doing this summer? He's like, not much. If Phil Kimmey was actually working a job, Rover would not exist. I mean, if he had a legitimate job.
Really?
I'm like, do you want to come and hang out with me? We can actually build this thing out for real and see if anyone shows up. And he says, sure. And I can't remember. I was probably embarrassed. Like, I don't know what we paid him, maybe a couple $100 a week, or it was terrible if I look back on it. But he's still at Rover today. He's,
really,
he's one of the most senior execs, and he's fantastic. So that's great.
That's an amazing. And was there sort of a moment in your head that when Rover happened?
Parents are really upset.
Oh, is that right? They're like, what did you do? When you went through Rover, did that change your mindset of you as an entrepreneur? With that experience, like, you're like, I mean, you'd been one of the, if not the most respected venture capitalist in Seattle. And like, I mean, you had tons and tons of deals. Suddenly then here's Greg Gottesman, this entrepreneur. How did that shift in your mindset a little bit? Like, what happened as you were going through that experience and since?
Yeah, well, what happened is I did it, and so we started building it, and I was like, and so I was the initial CEO until we got a real CEO named Aaron Easterly, who's the reason for its ultimate success. Mm-hmm. Because if I was still running it, I don't know where that company would be. A long time ago for sure. But like, it was just like, once I started working on it, and it started, and customers started coming, and I was passionate about the idea and what we could do. It just, a light bulb went off. It's like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing with my life.
Yeah.
And so, just like being a lawyer, whatever, I was good. I would have been good enough as a lawyer. And I was a good venture capitalist.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wasn't, when you find something and you're like, oh my gosh, like I couldn't wait to get up and go work on it. That's when you found sort of, more of a calling. So for me, just psychically, and what I just feel like I'm meant to be doing was something more along the lines of Rover. So Rover was really a shift for me, and just because I was just having so much fun with it too. It was so, and even though I was only spending 10% of my day, because I was a full-time venture capitalist at the time, it was like, I always wanted to get back to, and was really excited to get back to what we were doing on Rover. And that really led me then to start a startup studio inside of Madrona, and ultimately start Pioneer Square Labs, which is where I work today.